Hello, and welcome back to today's American Flyer Trains for the continuation of a rebuild of number 370, a GM American Flyer diesel road switcher, a GP-7 from 1950, a Type 1. The first step in the disassembly will be the removal of the side frames on the front and rear trucks. And to do that, we're going to be removing on each truck 2 screws, one in the front, one in the back, that holds this frame to the truck. Now, one mention of something that we're not going to get to for a while until we get to the reassembly is that when I reassemble these, I always hand start these screws because in general they go into the softer metal of a truck. Now in this case, these trucks might be die cast, but in some cases on the chassis of the later diesels, the metal is much softer. So you don't want to strip anything, and you want to make sure that the threads are aligned so that you're not cutting new threads when you place these back in. So the rule of thumb is to put them in, to start them by hand. Now I like using the cradle because I like protecting these handrails that run on each side of a GP-7 and on each end. Sometimes, including for my own, these have been problematic and they can be popped off easier than you think. So I want to put it in a surface that is not going to allow the locomotive to turn over and not put any, if at all, any pressure on those rails. Having removed the side frames, that exposes the 2 trucks for each motor. Now when I removed the screws, I went ahead and taped them to some photography that I had made. So I'm ensuring that I'm putting the screws back into the same location, which I think gives me a greater chance that the threads are going to match. But there is one interesting thing on this rear truck, and that is I've never seen one held in with a yoke assembly before right here, which means we're going to be able to remove this die-cast truck, which again you don't find in the later diesels. They're usually attached to the chassis. Not only are they not die-cast, they're usually sheet metal, and they're usually permanently attached to the chassis. As permanently as they can be. You could actually get them off, but not very conveniently. But here they're going to come off just like a powered truck, and that is there's screws on either side. And I'm going to remove those and then lift the chassis out of the yoke. Having removed the 2 screws, the yoke, of course, then released the chassis. And there it is, something I've never seen before, is a die-cast diesel chassis. A little heavier than that normal soft metal that AC Gilbert used. Also notice that both axles are for gears as well, which means that I think AC Gilbert manufactured these and only used these kinds of axles so they were interchangeable, so that one truck was going to go on the front with a motor. All it had to have was the gear placed on the axle, and then you just continued using axles. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if later on that these are non-geared axles are in here as manufacturing started to be a little more diverse, and they finally figured out that maybe these are a little bit more expensive to manufacture than just the smooth axles without those grooves. And therefore the assembly people on the assembly line started really pulling from 2 boxes or 2 bins when they started making these. So these will be the easiest rear trucks I've ever cleaned and polished on a diesel because they could be removed. The next step is actually the first step in being able to drop the motor out so that I can get to it to rebuild it in all of its components. And that's the removal of this tape right here to free this wiring up, move it out of the way so I can get to a screw right here in the top of this weight and get it out of the way as well. I'm hoping that with the weight off, with the tape off, then the weight off, that I'll be able to extend this wiring a little bit so that the motor will drop down a sufficient amount that I can get to its components. Removing the tape right here, I was able to gain access to the wires, and I was able to remove the tape without having any disruption to the insulation on the wire. So I chose to move the wiring harness on the far side, the remainder of the wires on the near side, so I could gain access to that screw right there, which I believe releases this entire weight. Now the weight doesn't really present any challenges as far as getting to the motor, except that it just adds weight to the chassis while I'm trying to handle it. And I think it might allow me to extend the wires down without having to work the wires around the weight to gain access to the motor. I thought it was interesting that I noticed that the electrician's tape that was on here was really sticky and messy, and I believe that maybe AC Gilbert's assembly line workers use masking tape, just a small piece of masking tape, which I found inside the electrical tape, to actually hold those in this cradle. I think maybe that electrical tape was added later on. It was certainly a gooey mess. Another reason I believe that is that there's a piece of wiring right here, a piece of electrical tape, which looks like somebody might have created or tried to protect some exposed wiring. I'm actually going to take this off and see what's underneath, and see if we can do, if in fact there are some exposed wires here, see if we can do a little bit better job of insulating those. So the next step will be to release this, take this screw, and see if we can release the weight away from the chassis. As suspected, the single screw on top of the weight held it in place. Once the screw was freed up, it was just screwed into the chassis, the weight was immediately could be lifted up. I noticed there's quite a bit of gooey mess around this weight where it was bonding with the electrical tape. And this is why I've stopped using electrical tape a long time ago, especially on or near something that produces heat. It just deteriorates over time and becomes a very gooey mess. Also, as suspected, and I'm going to move this closer and then focus in, there was a joining of wires right here. Now this could have been done at the factory because there's knots, which was a factory practice, in both ends of these cloth insulated wires. But I can't tell if there's even any solder right there. It looks like that may be just a physical connection that was wrapped in electrical tape, although I would be surprised if that electrical tape had been surviving since 1950 around that particular joint. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break this. I'm going to cut it. It looks like there's plenty of slack to do that with. I'm going to slide a piece of shrink wrap down one of these wires, rejoin these physically and with solder, and then slide the shrink wrap back up, heat it up, and then get a good tight connection right there without using any electrical tape. Again, when I put this wire back in the trough on the weight, I'm going to use masking tape or some other type of paper-based tape that can also take the heat but will also hold it in. And this is not directly over the motor. It's going to be back here, but it's going to be close enough to the motor. It probably can feel a little bit of the heat coming off of it. But I'm probably going to use a masking tape just to cradle that. So everything is in position now. I'm going to go ahead and start washing some components. The truck that came off of the back, the two side frames, the weight. My gosh, I'm going to get all that goo off of this weight. I think this sets a record for the heaviest weight I've ever seen on an American Flyer train. And then the next step will probably be, actually I'm going to go ahead and join these wires first, because before I drop this motor out and begin working on it, I want that wire fixed so that it is not part of the problem. I don't suspect that it is, but I also don't trust it 100% because it almost looks like a physical join and not a solder join. A bond, before I drop this front truck out and then gain access to the motor. But you can see it looks like it freed up quite a bit of wiring so I could get to this. If you're watching my videos, you may have noticed that not too far back I was building an alcove, rebuilding an alcove for a customer, and it had nothing to do with the customer, but it just was the diesel had the absolute shortest wiring on it I have ever seen. And I really was struggling with getting this motor down far enough, getting the chassis down far enough that I could gain access to the motor. It was really problematic, and I'm hoping this one isn't going to be that way, but we'll see. It's giving me the appearance that it's ready and able to be dropped out. So a little bit of washing, a little adjustments to the wires, and then the next step will be right here on the clamp, on the field and motor assembly clamp. To take these two screws out and drop that truck so I can get to the interior part of the motor.